be here to tell us something. I don't know exactly about what, but will be related to your writings, your novels, which are very much appreciated clearly here. I like to say also that this evening should be felt in the memory of Geert Lubberhuizen, who was director of the publishing company De Bezige Bij, who first brought Mr. Kosinski's novels into the Dutch translations. The program of this evening is that Mr. Gra Boomsma, Dutch writer, who will lead the evening, lead the discussion and so on, will first introduce Mr. Kosinski to you. Then Mr. Kosinski will give his lecture. Then I think first Mr. Boomsma will ask some questions, and then it is open to you on the floor to ask some questions to Mr. Kosinski. The evening should then go until about 10 o'clock. There would not be an intermission in between, but at the end there are drinks in the hall, which I hope you will enjoy. This is the first lecture in this season of the series American Literature Today, which was so successful last year, and we hope that we will have many interesting evenings again also in the coming months. So, may I ask Mr. Gra Boomsma to give his introduction?
Ladies and gentlemen, children are remarkably strong. All myths about them contain a paradox. On the one hand, children are at the mercy of terrible, sadistic enemies and are about to go under. On the other hand, they possess powers beyond those of ordinary people and refuse to be victims. The young boy in Jerzy Kosinski's first novel, The Painted Bird, tries to escape from the demon of violence lurking near every person, every peasant, if you like, ready to pounce on any sign of encouragement, any weakness. The writer Norbert Kosky, one of the many literary disguises of J.K. in his latest and very daring novel, The Hermit of 69th Street, is, and I quote, still a World War II kid gripped by some inexplicable and not yet described or diagnosed emotion, unquote. He is afraid but manages to survive the cheap attacks from hostile journalists, I'm talking about Kosky, accusing him of not writing his own stuff. The Hermit of 69th Street is the intelligence revenge of a writer hermit, and at the same time a showcase of how a writer works, how he does it. All Kosinski characters, except maybe for Chancy Gardner in being there, become judges and executioners of their surroundings, haunted as they are by the shades of the Polish past, just like Joseph Conrad, symbolized by the letters SS and the figure 69 in The Hermit of 69th Street. Kosinski's young and old survival kids want to be in control because, in their mostly narcissistic view, the world begins and ends with them. His characters are painted birds, loners deceiving the ordinary flock. They realize, whether there is a war going on or not, that chance still rules and that they need to overcome that. Everything is allowed and nothing matters as long as it helps to bring about a personal fulfillment and most of all, independence. Kosinski's protagonists are wandering cowboys. In their quests for survival and selfish satisfaction, they resemble, to put it a bit boldly, Don Quixote and James Bond at the same time. Always on the alert, ready to strike back, marginal to all others, lacking in compassion or pity, sadistic and cruel as needed, never but never unprepared. Because passivity is surrender to chance, as being there proves, in my view. Crucial to Kosinski's painted birds is their passionate role-playing. They don't have a fixed address, and they lack a fixed identity. Metamorphosis is a means to become invisible, or a mere camera eye seeing every cruelty and feeling nothing. In this way, they are able to mold and demolish other people's lives. Maybe that's what Kosinski's creations do. They steal egos, they change and plunder lives. Their creative and playful acts are necessarily destructive because they have to stay in control. They devour the moment, the undivided present. Sexuality and murder, remember the letters SS and the figure 69, 69, in the Hermit of 69th Street, are closely connected in most of Kosinski's novels. The sexual act is the ultimate and intimate celebration of the instant, but it only postpones the awareness of pain remaining from past experiences. Living without the burden of the past or the predictable future is a way of being to long for. To quote one of the fragments of Steps, situated in a city called a mutant among the wonders of the world, and I quote, "I envied those who lived here and seemed so free, having nothing to regret and nothing to look forward to. In the world of birth certificates, medical examinations, punch cards, and computers, in the world of telephone books, passports, bank accounts, insurance plans, wills, credit cards, pensions, mortgages, and loans, they lived unattached, each of them aware only of himself." Steps is a fine example of Kosinski's way of writing. 49, not 69, 49 brief episodes held together by a watchful camera eye. I am not the first one to say that the writer is a camera with his shutter wide open, quite passive, recording, not thinking. Isherwood said it in the 30s, and Norbert Koski's working papers in The Hermit of 69th Street quotes him. Without Steps, the narrator would be only victim, whether he is a tourist, a fugitive, a child, a photographer, a sniper, or a skiing instructor. With Steps, these moments of being, he can command his own presence, counterattack, and, above all, observe like a voyeur. Kosinski's characters have the willful destructiveness of Captain Ahab in Melville's Moby Dick. They are, and I silently quoting again, confidence men, and must triumph and demonstrate their superiority, prove their ability to resist emotions. Actions speak louder than words, so the saying goes. The con man in The Hermit of 69th Street is the writer Koski, traveling between fact and fiction in his auto-fictional working papers. This brave, fragmentary novel full of quotations from fellow writers, functioning as masks, makes the reader a voyeur. He is allowed to look into the kitchen of the writer at work. The novel also proves that fiction is always a mixture of numerous voices, because there is no writer, dead or alive, who hasn't involuntarily copied, invaded, or infringed upon the literary folklore, the huge library of the world. Originality is a very difficult notion. In The Painted Bird, fire is the leading metaphor. In The Hermit of 69th Street, water is keeping the fragments tied together. The novel is a narrative tapestry. Words are like water. They flow. They are not hermits because they need each other. Writing is breathing, lending and blending. And novelists are swimmers and sometimes floaters. They reshape what is already there. Novelists make up, they deceive, they exaggerate, and they play roles. In an author's note to his Tales of Unrest, Joseph Conrad says, and I'm quoting, "As for the story itself, it is true enough in its essentials. The sustained invention of a really telling lie demands a talent which I don't possess." End quote. These words from a Pole writing in English might define the autofiction Kosinski writes. In The Hermit of 69th Street, autofiction means inner drama as much as it means history, the burden of the past. The art of the self Kosinski is practicing is role-playing, which allows disguises, masks, the counterfeit, an entire run of imitational devices, all used to allow an incomplete identity to hide behind a multitude. In this way, writing is an adventure or a blind date. You never know where you end up. Only death remains a shattering certainty. Thank you. And now the floor to Jerzy Kosinski.
Thank you very much. Listening about my own literary inventions, I realized that this may be a key moment to reflect upon, frankly, this particular hermit in this particular hermitage and on this particular street. On the surface, it might appear that I appear here accidentally. At the same time, let me be quite frank about it, from a purely novelistic, imaginative point of view, this is in a curious way a moment that could be compared for me, not for you, you don't know about it yet, as a prism in which great number of things meet and refract at the same time. I'm a writer. Writing is not a profession for me. It's a vocation. I write in the morning, and when I write, I'm the freest man of all. That's why it's in the morning. I can't wait to do it. By midday, the rest of the day invades the day. A writer writes, primarily this writer, for himself, for the act of developing the images. And if these images can then be developed in other darkrooms, which means in other languages, then they are so much bigger, and the writer thinks about himself so much more. And no writer thinks enough of himself or herself to keep on writing, because writing as a vocation at the time of television and film and all the massive, very fast-moving narrative devices is something very tough to sustain. I remember when many years ago, some 30 years ago, when I first was published in Holland. I will come to this later, because of Luger Hein, of Geert Luger I went to an American bank to apply for a loan. I had never done it since, but at the time I needed a loan, I thought, for a car. And I went to a perfectly legitimate American bank, and I was asked what was my profession. And of course I was very proud, very European about it, and I wrote down a writer. And the lady who was in charge of the loan said to me, yes, Mr. Kosinski, but what it is that you really do? That's a very good question. I'm not certain that I have answered it until this day. Hermit is in fact an answer to that application. We are all writers because we have to fill applications. When we tell one another who we are, if I'm to tell you right now why Gerd Luger is an important personality to me, it's a story. This is not a picture, there's no film made about it, no Gary Cooper representing Luger Hein. In fact, Luger Hein was better looking and taller even than Gary Cooper. I remember each time I was standing next to Luger Hein, I was reminded that's the proportion between the author and the publisher. There he was, a towering figure. And I don't mean his history, an extraordinary history of the man who during the war did something quite extraordinary. Attacked a German film based on a Jewish novel. Justice, the novel by Feuchtwanger. Luger Hein at the university, in the student newspaper, attacked it, and of course singled himself out. Out of this came a life of opposition, life of underground work, and great number of people survived because of what he had done. Hence, he was called at the time boss who works non-stop like a busy bee, and therefore the busy bee. The reason I'm here tonight, is because, one, I was published first in Holland 30 years ago in the first foreign language translation. 30 years, it's a long time. I don't write often, and I haven't written much. All my books have appeared in Holland instantly after the American edition. In fact, one of them appeared ahead of the American edition, which threw my American publisher into fit. Because at the time, by American law, if the book were to be published in a foreign language first, it would lose its American standing and anybody could then publish it. Which means I had to rush to publish 13 copies of the book by myself because Luger Hein was already going to print in the Busy Bee, and according to American law, put 13 of these copies on sale in continental United States and 2 copies in Canada. That's the relationship between the United States and Canada. And these books had to be bought legitimately. That meant by my friends waiting there with the check to prove that the American edition, which was mimeographed, appeared on American continent ahead of all of you, because as all of you know, because of this house, you appeared on American continent ahead of us, ahead of everybody else. That's why this is a very special evening for me. Luger Hein was the head of the Busy Bee, and if one day you were going to look at the poster of all the writers of Busy Bee, photographed on the 25th anniversary of the Busy Bee, it was quite a camera to photograph 25 egos. It was 25th anniversary, 200 egos, standing on one staircase. You will see somewhere up there Jerzy Kosinski, who looks quite different than he looks today. I took a look at the poster the other day. Busy Bee was my first foreign language publisher, and therefore it proved, in a way, 2 things at the same time. That the writer doesn't write in one language, and it doesn't matter in what language he writes. Am I less of a writer in Dutch because of a translation than I am in English? Clearly not. What one depends upon is the reader. Here, the kind introduction that my fiction heard, and I prefer very often not to hear it, my fiction perhaps would say, we don't know what Kosinski's works are all about. We will have to ask the readers. There's no way to ask the readers. The critics, like writers, like novelists, are creative. They create their own fiction about the fiction they read. The novelists create fiction about the things they see. One of the reasons I would not want to write a play is that I would not want the director of the theater to call me and tell me how many people left the audience after the first act. I don't want to know it. With fiction, I never know it, and hence, whatever it is said about the fiction, here or anywhere, or by anyone, is just as fictional as the fiction itself. Only the reading mind knows what it is that the reading mind perceives. And so hats off to Luger Hein, whom I miss, because I miss him because this was my European address, Amsterdam, precisely because I was published here right after the American publication, because New York in some way is Amsterdam reversed, or maybe it's the other way around. I know one thing, that it's the only two cities I know where I can speak in English without anyone being bothered by it. In fact, in New York, they are bothered by it. They say to me, "Senor, I'm sorry, I don't speak English, speak Spanish to me." Here I go to a bookshop, and I'm at home in England and in the United States at the same time. In fact, I'm annoyed that you speak Dutch in Amsterdam, because I'm so accustomed to function in English here. That means that I feel very much at home, and that means also it's a warning that you'll forgive me tonight if you'll have a sense that I feel so much at home with you here. This particular house is clearly responsible for I won't make it responsible for this institution, and the directors of it, and those who kindly invited me here and organized this evening, are clearly responsible for Manhattan that I consider my spiritual fortress. Without the decision undertaken in the room right here, the decision to build the fortress of Manhattan, I would not feel at home in Manhattan. Now, this is not passing the responsibility for some of my fortress-like fiction, but maybe there's something to it. I will return to it later when we'll talk about Fitzgerald and the metaphor of the Dutch sailors, which were so important to Great Gatsby. But that will come a bit later. In any case, this is the tribute that someone who comes from Manhattan, someone who walks very often along Amsterdam Avenue, and I won't tell you why I walk along Amsterdam Avenue very often, or someone who knows Harlem quite well, and someone, in fact, who shares with you the heritage. I'm a fellow at Yale. Yale University is in New Haven. New Haven is only 40 minutes by car from Hartford, and Hartford was, in fact, where at one time, directors of this place had to settle who owns what in New England. The architecture of the seashore in Long Island and the Long Island seashore is very much the kind of an architecture that I saw today taking one of the boats along the canals of Amsterdam. That's another reason that visually I feel very much at home here. I was reminded that writers live and writers die. A writer died last night, Alberto Moravia. I have never met Moravia, but Moravia, in a way, contributed, at least according to the critical obituary. Even obituaries are critical when it comes to writers. In the Times of London, he contributed a certain notion of, let's be blunt about it, sexual instinct. What's so strange about the sexual instinct that it has to be underlined as peculiar when none of us in this room would be here without it? Greed, appreciation of art, these things don't produce life. Sexual instinct is, in fact, the only authentic force legitimately left around. In Amsterdam, luckily, one is still reminded that it exists when one walks the streets, where the shop windows display both bankomats and sexomats. Moravia was one of the few who, for some reason, says the critical obituary, volunteered that obsession, they call it. Obsession? Really? With life? Come on now. All right, so much for Moravia. We will miss him. Because the books are here anyhow. So maybe we will not miss him, depending whether people like Luger Hein and other publishers will publish him. If he was a writer, which means he existed not because of his physical flesh, that is an existence of an actor. He existed because of the books. The books are here, Moravia is here, he has never left. That thing in the London Times is merely another literary criticism. I wouldn't be surprised if Moravia has read it tonight. We don't know these things about writers. There's another writer who died, and an important one, without whom the Hermit would not have been written. Just as feasibly, no novel would have been written without all the writers before. We should take it for granted. Would an architect build a house without knowing of other houses? Why is it perfectly all right for a painter to use shapes and colors and paint that clearly preceded the painter? Or for a sculptor to come up with all kinds of textures and forms and joining wood and glass and very often all kinds of other substances and creating a new sculpture of what? Of existing material. It is the design that matters, the new form of looking at old stuff, or whatever you want to call it. That refraction, that very refraction that makes my evening here, for me, profoundly dramatic. I wish every moment of my life would be as dramatic for me as my trip to Holland this time. So many things somehow seems to be falling into place and feasibly out of this place at the same time. The other writer whom I would like to mention briefly, without whom The Hermit would not have been written, was a writer who killed himself in 1940 on that day, Walter Benjamin. A writer who, a critic, an essayist, a writer who, even though his books and his essays, not novels, were translated into a great number of languages, could not find a place where he would be admitted in 1940. Leaving Spain as a Jew, he wanted to leaving France, trying to enter Spain, he wasn't admitted. The alternative was what? Concentration camp. Perhaps the wisest way was to leave the books behind and to depart to a place where no visa was actually needed. And so, no doubt, Benjamin is with us here today as well. I tested whether he's with us here today, and after a boat trip, I went to one of the shops on one of the main streets of Amsterdam, the way one can do in here, and I came inside and I said, "Hi, do you have anything of Walter Benjamin?" And the man said, "Sure, go upstairs, he's all there." That's the joy of Amsterdam. And so there I was, I said hello to Benjamin, he was there, essays, things about him, full presence, no trouble about it. By the way, a very good book about Benjamin that I saw here for the first time, not in the United States, is called Benjamin, Philosophy, Aesthetics, History, edited by Gary Smith, published last year by the University of Chicago Press. Those of you who might be interested in the notion of literary work as a cumulative device, in fact as an accumulation or a battery, depending of ideas, depending how one wants to see it, might like to take a look at that. It is an interesting anthology. John Adams. It occurred to me that because of Jefferson, who is always in the present tense, an extraordinary figure, Jefferson and Adams formed what might be termed perhaps a very modern relationship. Not because of their correspondence. Friends do correspond with one another, but they were politicians. Politicians far more divided at the time than politicians are divided today, since today politicians have to debate one another, like schoolboys on television. You have 3 minutes, I have 3 minutes. You have an argument, I have an argument. We are examined, if we are politicians, by 3 or 4 teacher-like figures. Jefferson and Adams were quite extraordinary beings in the sense that they were profoundly articulate, literary men, and that by strange event of chance, they died on the same day. Perhaps the best thing to happen for two people who were so close to one another and so far apart that one did not outlive another. Even there, their correspondence somehow was even. Both letters remained either opened or unopened. A marvelous thing to happen for two people divided and joined at the same time. Jefferson is interesting in a sense in which I am interesting. Now, how about that for modesty? I committed to the Hermit of 69th Street anything I could or felt I should about Kosinski, who stands there as an independent character, because I have a right to feel independent vis-à-vis my book. After all, am I to pretend that I'm not part of this book? My name is on it. I don't even care who wrote it, frankly. My name is on it. My picture is on it. And I always recall the nice lady who, when she read that thing in the Village Voice, stopped me on the red light in New York, not red light district, red light, which didn't change. She looked up at me and she said, "Oh, Mr. Kosinski, how are you?" I said, "I'm fine." The light was about to change. And she said, "You know, I love your books, and I really don't care who wrote them." And I said to myself, you know, that's basically what's all about. I mean, after all, isn't it what I care about? I mean, do I really care? What is I care about the book? I mean, are we going to check with Moses? Were there 5 books of Moses or 7 books of Moses? How many editors were there? Proofreaders. The books. All right, in any case, back to Jefferson. I committed Kosinski to the Hermit of 69 because Jefferson withdrew Jefferson from his autobiography. If you have a chance, for the sake of John Adams, an extraordinary figure, the second president of the United States, and one who saved the United States because of a very generous loan, the loan that originated right here. Again, I'm passing the blame for the Hermit of 69th Street on to you. Without that loan, no United States, no Jefferson. With no Jefferson and no United States, no Kościuszko, with whom Jefferson had a very close relationship. Without Kościuszko and Polish relationship to Jefferson, Kosinski would not have gone to the United States in 1957. He would have come straight to Amsterdam. We don't know what will happen then, and so forth and so forth. But in any case, Jefferson writes an autobiography. One of the most literary men in the world. Imagine a man who writes a sentence, "All men are created equal." Do you know how tough it is to come up with something like that for the first time? How long the sentence is? Some people would devote weeks to explain it. Nobody would believe it. All men are created equal. All. That man removes his 7 or whatever the number of sisters. And that's not because he was an anti-feminist. No, he removes his family from his autobiography because he's honest enough to know that those who are going to read his autobiography are not going to read it because of his family. They're going to read it because of who he is as a figure. Not a figure of speech, a figure of action, a figure of independence, a figure of declaration, a figure of all men are created equal. Now that's a hell of a bravery to sit down to write one's autobiography and remove auto from it. I did the opposite, but that's the freedom I got from Jefferson. All men are created equal, but not all the books. I can do what I want to do. Back to John Adams. Imagine his wife. Now it's very easy to talk about John Adams and then John Quincy Adams, but there's a woman there. A woman who's the wife of this man and a mother of the 6th president of the United States. She's the wife of the 2nd. This is not the time of the jet plane, and in all due respect, KLM, I won't plug any other airline clearly. Trips take time. When you disappear, no fax machine, no telephone. That's an extraordinary life that you have to deal with. When he arrived in the United States, when he arrived here in the provinces, he was slandered. And how? The slander came a bit slower than in other cases. Nevertheless, she was left there to defend her husband. it occurred to me to take a look at Abigail Adams. And again, if I can recommend somebody else, take a look at the biography of Abigail Adams, which was published recently in the United States. An extraordinary woman and an extraordinary biography. It's called Abigail Adams, a biography by Phyllis Lee Levin, I think just published in the United States. The book literally reads as a diary, almost as if Abigail herself recorded it, since these used to be very literary people. And Abigail was probably one of the most articulate women around. She had to be. Just imagine the personality of a woman who was the wife of John Adams, mediated between him and others, knew Jefferson, and mediated between the two men. Perhaps there's a very telling, in fact, paragraph in her diaries about women, that when women are patriotic, they are truly patriotic because they cannot expect, at the time at least, they cannot expect any office that would go with it. That's a true devotion at the time. It was an extraordinary devotion. What reward could Abigail Adams expect? What's your name, madam, again? Abigail. How nice, thank you. And here's John Adams with all the decor and how he writes about himself, how he was finally received here, and how finally he managed to create that estate up there, which happens to be one of the largest pieces of real estate created in recent times. I was told to watch time. I'm watching it. While at it, maybe this is the time to be grateful to this place, to the director of this institute, for bringing writers here. Writers, storytellers, rather than perhaps politicians. This is a very imaginative act on the part of this place. And if I can speak for myself, and since I have read so many writers and quoted, God knows, well, yes, I quoted, I was told the other day for a pedantic critic, I quoted 999 sources and 1,012 or whatever it was, not books. Well, that's quite a work, which means I have a right, at least now, to collectively, in the names of those I have read, say, thanks for bringing writers here, because you could have brought somebody else. There are not that many platforms where writers speak. And it's important, because after all, a voice of a writer is not important by itself. It manifests itself in the books that writers write. But nevertheless, again, let's not pretend. There is a human being who from time to time, she or he, would like to feel that we are part of a historical process. No less, no more important than John Adams or Jefferson, since after all, they also wrote books. Writing books, therefore, is novels, in this case, storytelling, is perhaps the only instrument, not perhaps, it is the only instrument known, whether to West Indies Company or to any other company, the only instrument that activates images from within. Television, movies, video, photography, it's all from the outside. It's through the eyeball. The images are given, and they are totalitarian. The only thing you can do is either to close your eyes or to keep them open. That's the freedom you have. You cannot redo them. They are not yours. The printed word by itself carries absolutely nothing except one figure that is visual, 69. I was asked why 69. I said because the 6 is graphically the reversal of 9. It's the only figure of speech or a number that in some way graphically indicates something. Clearly, I won't say what. Take a look yourself. It may be easier in Amsterdam than in other places. Nevertheless, it is the only figure I could think which is graphic by itself. The print otherwise shows nothing. Whatever it shows is sufficiently intimate to be locked in the human head. Novels, therefore, are the only known instruments from activating us from within. To what degree they activate us from within Nobody knows, not even a photographer. Do I smile or do I continue? I was in a movie for a few minutes. I'm very conscious of these things. Now, I was born on June 14, 1933, and this is the year when the eugenic measure sterilization laws were introduced in Germany. An extraordinary moment in history, a moment in which a state would take upon itself a right to decide to what degree human brain had right to function. One could feasibly say that that day marked an extraordinary chapter, but only a chapter. Didn't mark the whole civilization, clearly not, but marked a chapter in a civilization, that the total state could decide a priori whether a being should live or die without any notion of crime, without any notion of being antisocial. One could be sterilized, and the sterilization was obligatory. The victim, the object of it, had nothing, or the parents of the child had nothing to, or the family could no longer oppose that. What came out of this was clearly extraordinary. What came out of this is simply that, as I am here tonight, I, at my relatively middle age, 57, have no blood relatives. Not because their parents were sterilized. No, they were eliminated. They were eliminated as a direct consequence of that law, which was passed probably rather casually. By itself, I don't imagine there were too many people who opposed the law at the time. After all, those who had to be removed were idiotic. They were non-productive. They were non-creative by the standards of the community. They had no reason to exist. And so the university professors and the scientists and a great number of other learned people probably said, well, yes, after all, society has to make a decision once in a while who should live and who should die. And here we are, some 57 years later, here I am, and as a result of that insignificant law introduced in the center of Europe by Christian nation, by people who attended lectures like this, much better lectures than that probably, because in much bigger places, and probably addressed by far more significant figures than a novelist. That nation passed it on and went along with it and with everyone else that followed after that. I come from Poland, and it might be of interest to mention that I'm trying to figure out what would be the best way to come to it. What happened in Poland during the Second World War is probably the most misunderstood or misshapen chapter in modern history, for reasons that only historians would know. Poland is, as you know, the very center of Europe. It's the seventh largest nation in Europe, with access to Baltic Ocean. A bastion of Christianity, Catholic religion, a dominant religion, and a country where for some 1,000 years Jews, in this case, resided sufficiently independently of the country to create the whole civilization there. A whole civilization, not only numerically. Numerically, they lived there in the largest numbers since biblical times. Various Kosinskis, that means Levinkops and Weinreichs, these were the family names. But they created a civilization so independent, in fact, of the rest of the country that they created their whole language, Yiddish. 10% of the population could speak it. There was no need to learn Polish if they didn't want to. They became mystical. The reason I stand right now the way I do, the reason I write, the reason I move, is to a large degree inherited from that extraordinary civilization which somehow began in Krakow. Krakow is, let's reverse the phrase, Auschwitz-Birkenau is within an hour's drive from Krakow. And quite likely, Auschwitz-Birkenau is where most of my blood relatives, one way or another, perished together with 1/5 of all of Poland. Imagine a Central European nation in which in 4.5 years, 1/5 of the population is exterminated. Half of this 1/5 are Polish citizens who are Jews. The other half are Polish citizens who are Catholics. They are exterminated not by Turks, by Muslims, against whom Poland defended all of us at one time in Europe, but they are exterminated in the most casual fashion, not even individually, but en masse, like rats, exactly that way, exterminated by asphyxiation, not through normal, dignified, tortured way. I went the other day to the Torture Museum in Amsterdam, exhibition of torture instrument, and I might parenthetically add that the young American woman was walking out of this, and she saw me and she said, Mr. Kosinski, I'm sure you would love it. So much for the literary criticism and its effect upon innocent people. But in any case, to go back to the things that I do not love, at least the torture instrument that you can see in this museum would bring the torturer intimately close to the victim. This was not the case of the Nazi occupation of Poland. When one is a Jew from Poland, a Polish Jew, one tends to hear about Poland, and what about Poland during the war, and what about the relationships between Poles and the Jews, and one forgets about a very minor thing, that just as these laws in Nuremberg were enacted on the 14th of June of 1933, there was another law enacted by the Nazis that was valid only in Poland, not even in the Third Reich, when it came to the Jews. And that law was plain and simple, that anyone who would shelter a Jew like me, now with my profile, you must admit, I do not look like a Viking. And as a child, I would probably look even less like a Viking than I look now. Anyone who would shelter a Jew in Poland was he, she, all the family together were subject to instant execution. Death for sheltering a Jew. No other country in Europe, not even a country incorporated into Third Reich, not even in the Third Reich, there was such a law. And that law came with another law, that anyone not denouncing anyone who would shelter a Jew would end up in a concentration camp, and an average life expectancy in a concentration camp was 9 months. Under these conditions, to try to sort out why the Poles, the Polish Catholics, who were second on the way to the gas chambers, did not massively rescue Jews, is as abstract as to ponder why the water in the canals has a shade of gray rather than the shade of blue. It was a situation like no other. 1/5 of the entire country vanishing in 4.5 years, annihilated in the most extraordinary fashion. Human life, no definition attached to it. This is how a German account, economic account, defined the remnants of my family and any other family of men and women who perished during that last war in that place called Poland. Average daily income from an inmate of a concentration camp, 6 German marks. That's my uncle, professor of philosophy. Books about Greece, ancient Greece, about Rome, and Jews in Alexandria of the 7th century. The word of the man, average daily income from an inmate, 6 marks. Less food, less amortization for clothes, net income 5.30 marks. Average life expectancy, 9 months. income from efficient utilization of corpses, gold teeth, valuables, clothes, money, less cost of burning the corpses, 2 marks, total profit after 9 months, German marks 1,631, to which must be added income from utilization of the bones and ashes. There you've got the Holocaust, the genocide in a nutshell. What can one counter this with? I went today to something I have never seen, to the Sephardic synagogue that stands in Amsterdam, and I expected to find a small little building, and I found myself in a building so large that my camera, I have one too, with a 24mm lens, that's relatively wide angle. In fact, I never thought I would need a wider angle than that, could not grasp all of the interior of that synagogue from any corner within it. I would have to fly out of the window, something that, even though I float in the water, I couldn't do, to photograph it. That's how huge it is. Yet, if I were to ask my American friends whether they know about it, they would not know, and they would ask me, is there a new Holocaust memorial in Amsterdam? What I'm raising right now is an important philosophical issue. Am I to remember what happened? I, as a writer, Norbert Koski, if you want, in the Hermit of 69th Street, which is basically a novel that deals with identity versus the self with the capital S, the self meaning history, the self meaning parents, the self meaning who am I? Am I myself? Am I a hermit? Am I totally independent of anything? Or do I depend? Do I depend on what? And do I depend on whom? Am I historically defined? Or am I hysterical about it? Am I going to scream about this? Am I going to make a big thing out of the fact that the ashes of 65 or 69 or whatever the number of the members of my family are scattered somewhere in the world? Or should I make a big stink about their books, which are alive still, but nobody knows where they are? Should I renovate this place here in Amsterdam because it speaks for thousands of years of presence, potentially, as well as for hundreds of years? Should I go after Ladino as a writer, a language, a whole language that vanished? After all, Jews, I'm told, are clever people. My Spanish friends who play polo with me say, hey, how come that you play such a good polo? Well, it's not hardly good at my age, but it's sufficient. And I say, because my predecessors ran away from Cossacks on horses without saddles. That's why. Cossacks had saddles, we didn't. That's a simple reason. Fitzgerald wrote about it somewhere in The Last Tycoon. Why the Jews of America are so keen about horses. That's why. Back to the monuments. What are the monuments? Are the ashes the monuments? Or are the monuments the monuments? Imagine Jews who have 3 languages at their disposal, not mentioning languages they routinely speak or invented, Esperanto. Hebrew, Yiddish, and Ladino. Languages in which millions upon millions of books and lectures and songs and philosophical works were written. And Jews no longer know Ladino. You ask if there is such a thing as an average Jew, as a Jew I can say that there is, you ask an average Jew Ladino, he would say, well, what is this, a nightclub? A Latin nightclub? They don't know. I'm mentioning this because in a few days I'm going to address this issue in New York, and I'm, as you can tell, mobilizing myself psychologically. It's not going to be easy. The largest museum to the Holocaust is about to be, a memorial museum to the Holocaust is about to be erected in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States, just so you wouldn't think it's the state of Washington or Seattle. It's going to be huge, really huge. It's going to dwarf the synagogue many times. And meanwhile, there's no museum of Jewish presence or Jewish achievement. No foundation that would say that Jews have been universal, that they spoke all kinds of languages and wrote all kinds of books. This efficient utilization of bones and corpses is not my history. That account belongs to somebody else, to an entirely different group. No Jews in history ever worshipped the act of destruction. You know it better than anyone. After all, you are Dutch, aren't you? All right. How's the time? Well, yes, going Dutch. I have it marked here. This is very important. Since The Hermit of 69th Street, and I want to plug the book, after all, my publishers, please from time to time mention it. 60 guilders, that's a hell of an amount of money for I will come back to that. I mean, this book is worth it, clearly. There's no doubt that maybe it should cost even more, since it is not really a novel. It's a matrix, it has footnotes and all that. But for an average novel, I think that would be a great deal of money to pay. In any case, The Hermit of 69th Street is a result of a realization that one is always going Dutch, even if one is not directly, when one creates whatever it is that one creates. In the 14th century, I had one quote which did not appear in this edition of The Hermit of 69th Street, but is going to appear in the next, in a paperback, from someone called Willem van Hildegerburg. You know how to pronounce it. These things are impossible for us in the New Amsterdam. And a nice paragraph which he wrote, read more or less in English translation. I wouldn't dare to read it to you in Dutch, because you will all leave the room. In English it says, "Those who read this book, we beg them to correct anything that may see which is amiss, for they who wish to understand such things know very well how hard the matter is." Writing is a hard matter, since one never knows what matters in it and what does not, since clearly one writes in abstracto, so to speak, with nobody concrete in mind. Coming here, I noticed that F. Scott Fitzgerald had a great problem in different drafts of his novel, Great Gatsby, what to do with the phrase, Dutch sailor's eyes. He kept reassigning the identity of a Dutch sailor. By Dutch sailor, he apparently meant, I quote the critics who read this back and forth, they can't figure out why he kept affixing the idea of a Dutch sailor to various characters in Great Gatsby. The idea was that he wanted to say by it, or to indicate, a state of enormous admiration for something new, for a new continent, be it a new woman, a continent that you see with the new eyes for the first time, Dutch sailor's eyes. And so in various drafts, he kept moving this thing from one place to another. First he gave it to Nick, then he gave it to somebody else. Finally, he gave it to Great Gatsby. I hate to think what Village Voice would do with that. In fact, that's why probably I have it. But in any case, it is something, if you have a chance once in a while to see how writers write, take a look at different drafts of the novels, and you see that basically what we all try to do, writers and non-writers, is to find out where the punch should go, where to indicate, where to have a leitmotif clearly enough indicated. And Scott Fitzgerald was a good case in point, since the metaphor was too good to part with it. I would simply use it as a footnote. And I did. At the end of The Hermit of 69th Street, the book ends with both versions. With the version from his almost last draft, and then from the book as it was published. There are two different endings, but it's interesting how he could not sort out to whom eventually to contribute the Dutch sailor's eyes. This brings me to another almost final point, being there. I heard before that my characters meaning, to a degree, perhaps the character that I commit to my characters or my protagonists, that basically they are in a state of relative defense or attack, against the world, that they are cunning, that they are manipulative. And I would like to see it the other way, in fact. I would like to propose the opposite reading of it. I would, for instance, pick up Cockpit, a novel about a relatively strong man who's totally traumatized when the elevator's door do not open, falls into pieces. I would like to do the opposite what is normally done, and that is that when you have, in the United States very often, at the meetings where American Jews so often meet in large ballrooms to collect money for yet another monument to the Holocaust, there's always a Holocaust survivor. By now, these Holocaust survivors, surviving less and less, they are older and older. And they speak the language which could feasibly be described as a survivalese. It's not a normal language, since they have behind them a reality that is not conveyable. And they sit on the dais, and very often the others who have not gone through the Second World War, as some of you in this audience whom I know personally did, refer to these people as being the strongest because they survive. It's the other way around. They are the weakest. They are barely making it. To sit for 6 hours on an American dais, that by itself is a heroic act, since you must remember you cannot leave it. And if you are a survivor of the Holocaust, that's a pretty difficult situation. The question, therefore, is to what degree all my novels are in fact not about people who are profoundly weak and who are barely making it, who mobilize themselves the way most of us do when they have to speak in public, when they have to address an audience that is not an immediate family, when after all they have gone through, people still ask them things which they shouldn't be asked because there's no answer to that. Are they saying, did it really happen the way it happened? Or tell us about it. The United States is very good about shortcutting things. A monument to the Holocaust says nothing about what happened. What does it say? A slab of stone, or a museum with thousands of glasses, or shoes, or suitcases that no longer belong to anyone, or can carry anything or see anything. The United States is a country which is tough because it's ahistorical, and rightly so. The country was never invaded by anyone. And so it brings a certain state of additional awareness to us, and therefore perhaps I have written the books I have written the way I have written them, since the society at large encourages free expression. I can express myself in any fashion I want, but the characters I create perhaps should be read in the very opposite fashion, at least in the opposite fashion that you were kind enough to read them, maybe as being ultimately traumatized by being from two continents at the same time. Take Being There. Now, Being There is about the character who's technically non-driven, anwezig, his presence. Maybe he's the truly wise personality. Maybe he's the one who knows that there's no point anymore of arguing anything. You are just there, and if the world can come to you through television, so much better than to go out and seek it. Seek what? Anxiety? When Being There was published, there was sudden run on the book by doctors in America. My publishers called me very alarmed that a great number of orders came from the medical personnel, and they thought that either I suffered from an unusual disease, or I addressed a conference of doctors and I didn't notify the publicity department, because 5,000 books were sold within a week. Now, I was very pleased, but in a way curious, why medical personnel only? Within a week, the secret was revealed. The Journal of American Medical Association, the most prestigious medical publication in the United States, had an editorial about what was called Sane Insane, in which the authors of the editorial claimed that there is a new category that emerged in our society, and that category can no longer be routinely designed or defined or divided into sane or insane, that there should be a third dimension where you cannot tell whether it's this or that. And that condition should be called unsane, as opposed to insane or sane. And that only being there referred to that condition. I was eminently proud. I promptly called my doctor. I said, did you read the editorial? Here I am, an author of a medical novel. Chauncey Gardner represents a new condition. You cannot tell anymore. Maybe all my characters are neither here nor there. Maybe all of us by now are. Imagine the time when I was writing Being There was quite different than it is now. The book was published by the Dutch publishers. The Dutch publishers published in 1970. The Americans in 1971. There you have it. That's why these 13 copies had to be rushed to be sold. There was a politician at the time who ran for presidency in the United States. In 1967, I was teaching at Princeton at the time, and as a sociologist, I was observing the American political scene. And after his 1967 race, his name was McCloskey, he himself took a public opinion poll. And the public opinion poll, which he himself sponsored, showed that of all the people who voted for him, only 5% did so because they knew his views and agreed with them, while 84% admitted they had no idea of his background, but voted for him because, quote, he appeared to be sincere and honest on television. There you have it. This is the unsane. Take the children. Coming here, I picked up something that might be of interest, that if your child watches no more than 2 hours of television a day, that's not heavy viewing by American standards. The American average is 7 hours and 30 minutes per day. Something that, don't sigh, you will reach it very soon, I can tell. It's only the matter of channels and time. If your child would average 2 hours of TV a day, each is getting 730 hours of television a year. 730 hours of television a day is equivalent of what forget the Hermit of 69th Street. That would be a therapy and a rescue. No, they can't. They can't because television tells a story, no doubt about it. If you're impatient, you move from one channel to another. I watch television by walking from one channel to another 40 times a minute. I watch television by changing from channel to channel. I don't watch it. I'm too anxious to know what's happening on the next one, and so I keep moving. There's nothing wrong with that. With all this, my attention span is still longer than probably the national average, or the European average attention span. Since after all, the attention span is getting shorter. Things have to be frenetic. We get bored quickly. Video is coming home. A novel, this brings me to the point, a novel is almost an abnormal device. By itself, it offers nothing. I return to that point. You have to come with your own images. You have to open your own film studio inside. You have to activate parts of yourself that you never even that you are not aware exist. You have to be rigid physically. You can't walk around the room and eat and talk to your friends and read the novel at the same time. You just can't. If you have to do all of this and pay 60 guilders, I think we are in trouble. I think novels should cost 3 or 4 guilders. It's a one-time injection. Maybe that's the wrong term to use. Could we come back? It's a one-time excitement. It's a one-time prodding of the mind. You don't read novel again and again. It should not cost 60 guilders or $29 in America or whatever. A textbook, a biography of Abigail Adams, yes, I can go back to it each time someone will mention Adams, each time I will go to Hartford, each time I will come back to Holland. That's a reference book. But a novel prods the mind only once. How many novels I know that I myself would read again and again? Very few. Which means we should perhaps come back to the time to rescue that device, the only device that prods the mind. We should start Maybe the writers, maybe Luger Hein should come back and start a new venture in which books should be published in novels in an extremely small, cheap format, so people could buy 6 or 7 novels a day and become novel freaks, hooked up on their own imagination. Otherwise, it simply will not survive. Keep in mind that you can buy a video cassette for that kind of money, or on many audio cassettes on which you can keep recording different stories again and again. We have a competitor, we novelists. I noticed in a Dutch, clearly, I discovered it here, not in America, because here the bookshops, as I said, carry that extraordinary spectrum of published things. I noticed something that absolutely fascinated me, and I think I brought it with me. I should have brought it with me. And that is books which were published in the United States during the war for the soldiers. They could fit the pocket of the soldier's uniform. They were literally the size of a postcard, and the full novel could be in it, and it will cost peanuts. I think that may be the time to do it again. Now let me see whether I have it. Oh, yes, I have it. Now here is a book, a novel of a man I actually met. He's no longer alive. John Marquand, Repent in Haste. Look at that. Now that's a full novel. Now why not to have 15 of these being available to any reader who wants to really become imaginative again, keeping it right there, and there you are, reading it, throwing it out, buying another 3 novels a day. I think this is the only chance we have to have future writers coming to this place. Otherwise, you'll eventually, I respectfully submit to the directors of this place, you will end up inviting movie directors here and television performers. There was an ad, there is an ad, which is very popular in the United States, of a woman who is shown very contorted in medical magazines and in other magazines. That ad in various forms have run for a very long time. Let me parenthetically remind you that in American publications, men are shown very seldom truly ill. They suffer from the back pain when they play golf or tennis, but truly contorted and truly sick creatures are always women, where in fact we know it's the other way around. Women grow life, we do not. But this is the way perhaps American macho defines itself. So there's this picture of this woman who's sitting truly contorted, and she's portrayed in descriptions. She's described as a person who is tense, whose facial expression is tense, who complains of waking early in the morning, who is agitated, restless, and irritable. That's the way so far most of us are. You don't see anything in it that requires very special definition. Who finds it, quote, almost impossible to start work every morning. Who notices that her palms from time to time are moist. Who thinks that she has a nervous stomach. She thinks she has a nervous stomach. And she says that she lost interest in most things, and also that she's tired and listless most of the time. This sounds like a perfectly normal description or a perfectly normal human being. Yes or no? No. The drug that is recommended for this woman is the drug that would make any one of you unable to come to this lecture, not to mention listening to it. It's one of the most powerful psychic drugs that literally would render this woman, who's not suffering, who's in fact going through the most normal aspects of life. She's not a hermit in a hermitage for crazy people. She's an ordinary human being who finds it difficult to start working in the morning. Unless you're Kosinski, who enjoys getting up early in the morning because he likes to write, most people find it difficult to get up early in the morning. The reason I do not is that I sleep in the afternoon. That's in 2 shifts. This is a classic case of a definition by society which defines a perfectly normal human behavior as so incapacitated that it deserves a drug, once again, that to start with would, in fact, disallows her driving a car. That woman, by American standards, which basically means the standard of our forthcoming or actual civilization, is already on the way to the hospital. Now, how do we defend ourselves against such definition? Is this sane, insane, or insane? Because if this attitude is going to triumph, if the passivity that comes with watching television for 7.5 hours a day will triumph, then clearly what I do, and what some of you enjoy still pursuing, writing of a novel, will not survive, no matter what the price. The attitude to life will become ultimately passive. If we will be defined by such formulas, if the symptoms, not even actual condition, but just the symptoms of our behavior, will be defined by society as innocently as that, just the picture of this woman sitting there, not that at ease with the world, because after all, it's a pretty difficult place up there. If this is going to be already considered not to be tolerated and requiring a powerful drug, then one day we may be back to June 14, 1933. And we might say, you find it difficult to start early in the morning? Well, too bad. There you go. Which means, what is normal, what is not normal? I have a very valid question to ask that, since a great number of people ask this of me. And from time to time in the United States, there are people who patently refuse to sit next to me at the dinner table, saying, I read his books, I don't want to be next to this man, I don't know what he's going to do, or say. And it occurred to me to end this at a note of Harold Pinter. Harold Pinter has a very interesting play, which is called The Birthday Party. And you may recall the play, since you are very dramatic and very theatrical in Holland. And The Birthday Party caused a great deal of trouble for Harold Pinter. Great number of people would write him saying, what do you mean, and all that. And apparently, this is a letter which he received from one of the people who saw the birthday party. And the letter says to Pinter, Dear sir, I would be obliged if you would kindly explain to me the meaning of your play, The Birthday Party. These are the points which I do not understand. 1, who are the two men? 2, where did Stanley come from? 3, were they all supposed to be normal? Yours faithfully, so and so. Now, Pinter is not an ordinary playwright, and so he wrote a reply. And the reply says, Dear so and so, I would be obliged if you would kindly explain to me the meaning of your letter. These are the points which I do not understand. 1, who are you? 2, where do you come from? 3, are you supposed to be normal? You will appreciate that without the answers to my questions, I cannot fully understand your letter. Sincerely yours, Harold Pinter. Thank you. Thank you. I was told that I can freely tell you that you are free to, are there rules in Holland that I clearly don't know? Oh, I have to print. Oh, I'm already being censored. I'm already being sent to the corner. I know. All right. All right, let me just grab all my notes, all the insane, unsane, and others. And
That's the problem of not having a break.
I see. Do you have enough light here, actually? Do you have enough light? You do?
Ladies and gentlemen, before I give you the opportunity to put some questions to Mr. Kosinski, I'd like to ask him one or two questions. First of all, there is a chapter in The Hermit of 69th Street dealing with Hollywood and the Oscar nominations. In it, Mr. Kosinski is like a very awkward actor, and he's at the wrong place at the wrong time, saying the wrong things. What I like to ask Mr. Kosinski, do you like to be or prefer to be a hermit all of the time instead of also being once in a while, like now, in front of an audience, a public figure? Because if you write, you are the freest person of the world, and now you are an actor.
There you have it. It's the other way around. When I write, I'm a public figure, and here I'm truly intimate and private. I have no... Can't you tell? Do you really honestly believe that there's anything that I wouldn't tell you right now? Why? I have nothing to hide. After all the novels I have written? I mean, do you honestly believe that the young lady who stopped me in front of that horror museum, saying, Mr. Kosinski, you surely would enjoy that she hasn't detected that a novelist commits himself in the novels? I'm not a public figure. I'm public figure by the way Chauncey Gardner is, by implication. If my name were not on that novel, and without my photograph, which frankly I could have taken a better one myself, had that novel been written under a number, as I believe novels should be, so the novelist wouldn't have to trail them, I would be truly private. I like to think that the act of writing, committing one's vision, and all the terrible things that you have detected in my novels, to this, after all that, in The Painted Bird, and Steps, and Being There, and The Deviltry, and in Cockpit, and in Pinball, and now in The Hermit of 69th Street, is there anything that I couldn't possibly share with you that would upset you more than my novels? I like to think it's the other way around.
Well, I think we're different writers then, because I am the freest person when I'm writing, and I'm not the free person now. So we are different persons. I think you have an ambivalent attitude towards television. Chauncey Gardner, in Being There, is for me, as a reader of your books, and a book is only existing when you read it, a blank page, and he's not really there, in my view. He is projected. He is nowhere, in fact. He's manipulated from the outside. And that's, for me, a very alarming view. And at the same time, in your talk, you were saying that Americans are watching, averagely, 7 hours and 30 minutes per day, being very passive and looking. And don't you think that stating Chauncey Gardner as an ideal protagonist is slightly different from your view you stated just in your talk?
Again, I really would not know how to deal with this. Chauncey Gardner is a truly authentic personality. He trusts himself. Can I say that I have a great deal in common with him? I remember when the book was published initially, and I came to Holland for the publication of it. That was the last time, in fact, when I was here. I was asked by a kind interviewer who said, Mr. Kosinski, your character seems to be rather retarded. Is this an autobiographical book? And I said, well, that's going Dutch. I said, yes, to a degree he is, because so am I. I think in the time of media, the interpretation of a character is clearly external. The way the example of the politicians that we all know. The papers. Take a look at some of the reviews of my book. Now, I enjoyed enormously being interviewed by some of the gentle and kind and very well prepared journalists, writers who came to talk to me. And yet my photograph took more space than what they wrote. Who cares about how I look? I mean, I do, privately, of course I do. I shaved and I dressed and I try to look as properly as I can. But actually, to waste their hours with me and their talent and their being profoundly articulate about fiction and have a photograph of an author who's not an actor. After all, it's the Hermit of 69th Street who's making its debut in Holland. I am not. That is Chauncey Gardner. This is being there. Now, this is clearly a fact of life. This is not something that I have invented. But when Balzac was reviewed, when Tolstoy was reviewed, their photographs did not take over the text. We are already at the mercy of the visual. The author is totally insignificant. My wrinkles have nothing to do with Norbert Koski. His wrinkles are the wrinkles, the spiritual wrinkles, I like to think, or sexual or cultural, that a reader should detect. That space devoted to the photograph of Kosinski, it's a waste of space,
and then again,
of cultural space.
Then again, my question, is it not better for an author to stay a hermit, like, for instance, Thomas Pynchon?
No, to join Benjamin in Moravia before the publication of the book, disappear. This is Chauncey Gardner. In other words, Chauncey being there is part, and I think the English title of the book reflects it perhaps better than any other language, since the English verb is quite peculiar. Being there is already a contradiction, since I'm a being, which means I'm here, a human being. The state of being is now and here. There is the opposite of it. This is the condition. This is the unsane. This is the literary review of a book that carries a photograph of an author that is larger than the review. That's in Holland, not in the United States. We are in the same home. This is the presence divided. We are no longer purely inwardly motivated. We are motivated from without. Why the photograph? What for?
To attract attention.
Well, then let's have Robert Redford. An actor, a novelist, attracts attention through let's have a quote, a large extracted quote from the Hermit, or a phrase from Kosinski or from one of his truly very literary and very profound interviewers. A quote which would say, for instance, "You've got to buy this book. It's the best 60 guilders that you will ever spend, because this book will make you make a matrix of your own life, and even if you hate everything that Kosinski have written, the footnotes alone are worth 60 guilders." Fine. Let's be literary about it. This is the condition that is no longer defined by the writers. It's a condition defined by society that is becoming progressively more and more external, non-communicative.
A final question before I give the floor to the audience. I have read The Hermit of 69th Street as an anti-novel, as a kind of destructive novel. And I'll explain to you why. Because it lacks a narrative, or I should say there are 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 or 69 narratives at the same time. And there are a lot of voices, not one, but 69 or thousands voices. Especially two writers are, for me, essential to the book. One is a Polish one. He was murdered in 1943, Bruno Schulz, and the other one is a Hermetic writer, Giordano Bruno. Also, the names are mixing in a way. Can Can you explain why you choose those two writers as crucial to your novel? At least in my view, crucial.
Well, Giordano Bruno, clearly, because one is burned at the stake each time one publishes a novel. Bruno Schulz is an extraordinary character. Bruno Schulz was a Polish Jewish writer who died in 1942 after having written two novels, quite extraordinary narratives, very detached, Kafkaesque without the difficulty that I have reading Kafka. Which means perfectly readable, easily to translate in a sense, very modern by relying on associations which are clearly delineated. And Bruno Schulz was a figure that saw himself as insignificant. What was important were the two works of the two collections of, in fact, collections of fiction. He was also very visual. His drawings are extraordinary, and I hope that one day we will be able to show the drawings of Bruno Schulz. He was as talented an artist, as a master of drawing as one can possibly imagine. A sort of a fusion between Degas and Goya, but much more fetishistic. And Bruno Schulz died in a small town in Eastern Europe, in Poland at the time, killed by a German, who was jealous of Bruno Schulz painting a house for another German who simply killed him on the street with one bullet. But that's not the issue. Bruno Schulz is prototypical in a sense that there was a man who saw himself completely as a novelist, as a storyteller. He was teaching drawing in a high school, in a gymnasium. And because of that very idiosyncratic notion of fiction and very idiosyncratic drawings, I'm a photographer. I like visual arts. Not the cinema, not the video, and maybe, I hate to say that, I'm not that fond of theater either. Would this ban me from Holland forever? But I do like graphic arts. Bruno Schulz is a sort of a prototypical writer for me. Insignificant, small town. He could have been one of hundreds of writers in the United States that one knows, who live in small towns, teach writing or creative writing or drawing or gymnastics or whatever it is, and from time to time write a novel. He was 50 when he was killed, and in 1992 we will observe the Jewish Presence Foundation, of which I'm a part, will observe both the 50th anniversary of his death and the 100th anniversary of his life, of his birth. One day we may want to bring perhaps he's translated into Dutch, Bruno Schulz. Yeah.
With the drawings.
With the drawings. Now that mixture of the visual, a writer who combines the visual and a very idiosyncratically fetishistic visual with writing, which is visual in an inwardly sense, that's for me something very modern. Being burned at Giordano Bruno, that's part of history that we all inherited. In a way, sitting here, a novel and someone whose views are at stake, who is then brought to testify about them, that is the predicament of Giordano Bruno, since the flesh should not really be here. Ideally, it is the work that should stand here, not the flesh of the creator. And that's the reason of my particular preoccupation with Bruno Schulz, and the fact that at one time I have sponsored a Bruno Schulz Literary Prize, which is given in the United States every year to a foreign writer translated into English who is not sufficiently known. The irony is that the latest winner, Daniel Okish, died before being given the award. Maybe just as well, since the award is really for his work. So the award will contribute to the popularization of his work rather than to his photographs in the press.
Okay, we're still here. The audience may ask some questions now, please.
Maybe you can answer a question that I've always wanted to ask. Many years ago, I was given a book which was stolen from the library because it wasn't available in the city. It wasn't on sale. And I was only 3/4 of the way through the book. The name of the book was The Future is Art Commerce. And I was wondering if he put it away to looking stolen from me because somebody else wanted to read it. And the person who stole it from me told me that Joseph Novak was in fact Jerzy Kosinski.
That's why when I opened my lecture, I said that this is the 30th anniversary of my being published in Holland. The Future is Ours, Comrade was a collection of essays I wrote in 1960 in the United States, my first work written in English, about the mechanics of collective society. And it was published in English, and then it was published in Holland, not by the Busy Bee. The Busy Bee started with my novels. And so this is actually my 30th anniversary of being published in Dutch. I would advise you to get that copy back. It's a very valuable copy, and I would like to have it, because you can't find one. Well, go to the library, steal the book. But that's an extraordinary anniversary for me, since at the time this was the first translation of that book, of my first collection of essays. I wrote them why did I write them under the pen name? I will give you, Moravia, by the way, was a pen name. Moravia was an Italian Jew of Polish, well, Slavic Jewish, Slavic Italian heritage. And Moravia was an easier name to pronounce than his actual family name. I wrote my first collection of essays under the pen name because I was at the time on the Ford Foundation grant in the postgraduate studies at post-PhD graduate studies at Columbia University, and I didn't want to argue about the book with my professors. The advantage of writing a book under a pen name, and no one knows that you wrote it, is that you can recommend it to everyone as the best book that you have read. Anyone I dated at the time, I would say, look, would you mind if I buy you a gift? And the woman would, potential girlfriend would say, what is it that you want me to buy? That you want to buy for me? And I would say, this collection of essays by Joseph Novak. This is the most eye-opener, the most eye-opening essays I have ever read. Let it buy it for you. This is the advantage of writing under the pen name.
There was no photograph on it.
No photographs. No. That's another advantage, I think. It was a collection of sociological essays about men and women who have grown up under the totalitarian spiritual roof, and how they perceive and define themselves. It was followed 2 years later by another collection of nonfiction. By then I decided that really what I wanted to do was to write fiction, since fiction doesn't age. Nonfiction does. Take a look at any nonfiction book written about Eastern Europe, which took 6 years to research, which is being published right now. Eastern Europe is an entirely different continent right now. The books are no longer valid. The Painted Bird, published in 1965, is sufficiently valid as an instrument of imagination for some of the young people who have come to me when I was signing the book in the department store. They thought that this was the book that brought me to Holland, because they look at the newly published edition and they said to me, oh, Mr. Kosinski, I just read this book. Well, I like this book. They thought this book was written now. And had this been a movie made in 1965, it would have been an old hat. That's the advantage of fiction.
What's interesting is that there are portions in all your novels, fiction, which you can trace back to that book when you travel to Russia. And also, am I right? It was stolen from me, so I can't tell me if I'm right.
To a degree you are, since there is a sociological background. And I think some of my idiosyncratic notions, my fear of the collective society, my notion of the individual who must defend himself or herself against it, my notion of an individual who's defined from within, from inside, and not from without, not from the outside, they were clearly present in these essays. The Future is Ours, Comrade. Get the book again. Get the copy. There was a question here.
Do you have a strong mental world? Can you visualize? Can you have book visualization during writing?
Do I visualize the characters? No, I do not. I do not. Quite frankly, I do not. I visualize things when I take photographs. very often know ahead of time the kind of a picture I would like to take, and I look for it. In terms of composition, in terms of light, I don't really take that many pictures anymore. Though my wife tells me I have taken a great deal in Amsterdam, black and white and color. But I have no physical concept I have an intellectual concept of the character, and I have a notion of progression, of what I want to accomplish in terms of how do I want to trigger my own imagination, and therefore the imagination of the reader, since I see the reader as the very opposite of me. Opposite meaning the same, just at the other end of the same spectrum. An ideal reader would write what I have written. An ideal reader would be, in fact, the person who would say, and in fact, you do come across it once in a while. I get one, for instance, you asked me about the literary criticism of the Hermit of 69th Street. Mm-hmm. Now, there were only the reviews that were as profound as I can think of, so profound that I would say, my God, I wish I could meet the critic, or the reviews that, if I could, I would clearly get rid of the critic altogether, eliminate them entirely. But since the United States is the country of free expression, I had to be very banal about it and say, well, they just didn't get the point. Nothing in between. And I think I write for someone who thinks like me, and I assume that great numbers of people do.
Is that true? I mean, it sounds a bit dictatorial. The reader must be free too to give his own meaning to the book.
It's profoundly democratic.
He doesn't want to copy you.
Not at all. It's profoundly democratic. It means that the book will trigger in the reader impressions as idiosyncratic. We don't know what they are. As it triggered in me when I decided to write it. We don't know what they are. That's the advantage of fiction. It is, of writing fiction, it is the most democratic art form. It doesn't go after the man who leaves the theater and says to him, now why did you leave the birthday party? Why didn't you consider it normal? One never knows that. Which means I'm not talking about the same images. These images are not concrete. It's a notion of the self that is at stake here. If my reader will perceive the Hermit of 69th Street as the only matrix, not the only one, I would like to think the only, but not the only, as the best at the time, matrix upon which one could define oneself, going through a similar process, not the process that would lead to similar results. But if my reader, be it he or she, would say, look, to himself or herself, who am I? Can I change my life right now? Have I ever done a research about myself? What is it that moves me? Why am I here? What if I were to die 3 days from now on? What would I miss most? If someone would ask that question of himself or herself and go researching it, then I think that would be the purpose. This would be exactly what I have set myself to do when I sat down to write the Hermit of 69th Street, is to create a notion of personality that reviews itself, himself or herself. That's all. The outcome is clearly individual. There is no, well, I repeat that, there is no photograph that can be developed from a novel. Far out.
About 6 years ago, I'm an American. I saw a documentary called Shoah. I don't know if you mentioned.
Yes.
It was a little time before that I had read your first book, Painted Bird, your first novel, Painted Bird. And I, for some reason, found two things very much alike in many ways. And I wanted your comment, first, if you had seen the documentary, what did you feel? And second, what do you think of Poland and Eastern Europe and those rural areas and their culture today? Your master.
Shoah, I don't know how many of you have seen it, was an attempt by Lanzmann at a documentary. It was sponsored, it just so happened that it was sponsored by the foundation of which I was a chairman at the time, the American Foundation for Polish Jewish Studies. Shoah is, I said an attempt at documentary. It is, in my view, a profoundly subjective extract of events or personalities that a Landsman picked up to illustrate his point. I think his point was made ahead of the documentary, hence the documentary served merely to illustrate his very subjective point. I found the documentary Shoah to be slanted, to be preoccupied with destruction as opposed with reality, to be totally non-concrete in a sense that he abandoned the environment from which people who spoke to the viewer came from. He did not in any way indicate that the complex situation in which the whole country became a concentration camp, that those who spoke to him during the war were in fact almost as victimized, almost as those who passed them by in the cattle trains. It was a suspended exercise in almost abstract statements, ahistorical, non-sociological, devoid of history. The fact that our foundation sponsored it, well, there's nothing wrong with that. It is valid in one particular sense, that one can also look at history that way, if one wants to. If one wants to be truly ahistorical or non-historical. One could make then a very valid point, is there any other way of looking at history that is as traumatic as that, as riveted with pain? Is it feasible that if your family was killed by a tramway on that street corner, the whole family was wiped out, that you will never like that street corner, and you will never want to pass that street corner, and that you somehow will develop a terrible feeling about this whole place, even though they were not killed by the street, they were not killed by the purposefully not even selected, they were just killed by an event in the history of a tramway system. That trauma can slant your view of the tramway and of the intersection at which they died. This is Shoah. You can't be objective about it. But then there is a historical reality, and the historical reality is quite different than that. Those very people who talked to him in the film, whom he interviewed, were equally outside of any law. 1/5 of them was killed in 4.5 years.
You dealt with the same problem in the Hermit of 69.
The Hermit of 69 tries in a very novelistic fashion refer the reader to historical sources. But what has to be remembered is this, that what perished in 1939 in Eastern Europe was a whole civilization. Since he talked about Jews, let's for a second pause upon that. What was created once again in Eastern Europe was a Jewish civilization like no other. It was civilization that was independent of the Christian civilization, a civilization that in fact propelled and fueled the state of Israel. It was a scientific civilization that fueled thousands upon thousands of minds that then went out into the world outside and who create until this day, whether creatively and artistically in Hollywood or in Paris or in any other place, that it was a civilization that created the mystical notion of life and the freedom of expression reserved for the Hasidic storyteller, with a freedom without which I would not be free to commit all these terrible narrative sins that my novels commit. Without that period in Poland, I would not be free to do that. I would be still analyzing Talmud. There's nothing wrong with that. But for how long could it continue? And so all this is missing from that Shoah. And one more thing is missing from it. And that's very profound, I think. As much as I miss and regret my perishing of my family, for no reason at all, as much as I realize that they have been singled out differently than anybody else, they have been singled out simply because they were Jewish. And the German law specifically said that no Jew must be dealt with individually. They do not exist as individuals, the Jews. That was the difference between being singled out for extermination as a Jew as opposed to or as distinguished from being singled out as somebody else who would be arbitrarily defined to be gassed as a homosexual, as a gypsy or Romani, as a Jehovah's Witness, as a Soviet prisoner of war. Nevertheless, I must acknowledge that they also died by asphyxiation. And so even though my death, historically, 1/3 of my body, must have a very special meaning for me, since I was selected historically only for that quality of being Jewish, a cultural definition that is in some way subscribing to the Jewish ethos, Jewish folklore, Jewish tradition, and Jewish history. Others perished in the same fashion, even though they have been fashioned as victims differently through the arbitrarily created definitions why they should perish in the same fashion. And that's where the Holocaust meets the genocide. And that's where I must acknowledge an enormous common denominator of death by asphyxiation, with half of the Romanis, half of all of them, if numbers are the issue, while only 1/3 of Jews were asphyxiated to death. This is the moment when I must acknowledge within myself, even though I might not like that, I may want to scream Shoah rather than genocide. I must look upon the 4.5 million of the Soviet prisoners of war who were of your age or younger and who were suffocated to death by gas because Stalin would not exchange them for the German prisoners of war. And this is the time when I have to think about half of all the Romanis. And what did they do to deserve that? They, so innocent that they wouldn't even stay in one place to be guilty long enough at one particular historical address. Or the homosexuals, or the Jehovah's Witnesses, or the countless Slavs, Poles, Russians, Belarusians, communists and non-communists. Life is life. And dying is dying. That's what Shoah missed. He talked to people who were victims themselves. When they look at the trains passing them by, they look at their neighbors being taken to death. What did you expect from them? That they would stop the trains? Did Churchill stop the trains? Did he bomb the railroads? Did Roosevelt stop them? Did my friends, Jews of America, did? There is a question mark which has to be answered somewhere there. The Museum of Death is not reserved to people who call it Shoah. So much on that.
The language in which the novel was written was not important. Could you explain that?
That the language in which I wrote,
It's not important.
that the language itself is not important, that the story is. That's a very good point. Except the Hermit of 69th Street, where I purposefully started to play upon the language, because I wanted to have, for once, fun with myself. And I love language, and I come from a tradition from a tradition of a family tradition that always felt that language was all that mattered. In fact, I like to see myself as a storyteller rather than a novelist. In the Hermit of 69th Street, I agree with you, I violated this principle in a certain way that I made the translations work a martyrdom. And maybe this is the time to acknowledge the work of my Dutch translators, in plural. Those who translated my works, they're all here, all three of them, or four, sorry, or five. But the Hermit of 69th Street is a unique difficulty. It poses a unique difficulty precisely because one has to find a counterpart to that play on the language. And that is something that I have quite consciously done, being for once very self-centered. I will not do it in any other novel, I promised. I have three works of fiction, not quite finished yet, 2 novels and a collection of short fiction, where I'm again detached from the language as much as I can, where the verb and the noun and the action is important, and associations are clearly defined, and the language as a mechanism of trickery or manipulation is no longer as important to me as it was in the Hermit of 69th Street. But I guess any novelist, like any actor, or any industrialist, or any financier, deserves a moment when he or she can have fun with their profession. They can suddenly invest in something they haven't invested before and spend more time on it. And Hermit for me was probably the most enjoyable time of my life, when I could, with full license, dwell upon life of other writers, and whenever I couldn't describe something as well as I would like to, I would say, there is somebody else who had done it better, let's have it. And that won't happen again. So I should really raise the remnant of that Coca-Cola to my translators, and particularly to the translator of the Hermit of 69th Street, because that is a labor for which simply there is no gratitude. It is a recreation and totally original at the same time.
No questions. I have still a quotation, because we're talking about quotations all the time, from the Hermit of 69th Street. And it goes like this. My favorite subject, it might be your words, is desire with a capital D versus death with a capital D, meaning where I came from to here, meaning what kind of man am I? In slightly different words, you told just exactly the same 5 minutes ago. Mark Twain, a long time ago, told us that there are 3 rules to write a novel. Unfortunately, nobody knows those 3 rules. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Jerzy Kosinski for tonight. For the next time, it's, I think, John Irving, and I wish you all good night. Thank you.